Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Words of Conversation here at the Bayit. We are very fortunate and honored to be able to have our scholar in residence this weekend, Dr. Marc Shapiro from the University of Scranton, and certainly a well-known author, widely read by so many different groups within the Jewish community. And he writes on a tremendous variety of different topics, and so that's the basis for some of the questions that I'm going to be asking you now, Dr. Shapiro, during our conversation. First of all, thank you for being here.
Pleasure to be here.
We're delighted that you're able to make it. I wanted to ask you, you're famous, or perhaps some would say notorious in certain circles, for your writings on two important areas of Jewish thought. One is the area of what is a Torah biography, and to what degree should it be a hagiography, which is sort of a glowing idealistic depiction of a Gadol B'Yisrael, versus factual biography of a Gadol B'Yisrael. And you've written about it, and your work on this Bal Sridei Eish, Rav Weinberg, was really groundbreaking and transformative for so many people who read the book, including myself. And so that's one area, and you've done other work on other very interesting and also controversial figures like Saul Lieberman and so forth. And the other area, which is another area for which you're very famous, is your work on the Rambam's Ikrim, and the whole area of the both tracing the historical milieu and perhaps the influences that caused the Rambam to compose the Ikrim. Your discussion in your very also groundbreaking book on the fundamentals or dogma within Judaism, the Rishonim who dissented from the Rambam, and the issue of dogma in Judaism in general. So I want to just sort of briefly address those two areas. If you could please reflect on the two issues. Number one, what do you feel drew you to these two focal areas of academic study?
Well, let's start with the first one. I've always been interested in the history of great Torah sages, Gadol Yisrael, and when I went to graduate school, already from the beginning, I knew that I wanted to write a dissertation on Rabbi Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg, because already in my yeshiva years, I had become interested in him. I was fortunate that the more I researched his life, the more interesting it became, and even subsequent to writing the book, I keep coming with new information, and it's a fascinating story. So I wrote the biography, I wrote the dissertation, and it became the biography. I published some of his letters. I never intended the book to become as popular as it became. I never thought it would. I thought it would be interesting to maybe scholars of Orthodoxy, Jewish history, and enlightened rabbis. I had no idea that it would, it really turned him into a household name, and wide spectrums of the Orthodox community, including very right-wing figures, Dayanim, Rosh Yeshiva, Poskim, who also found it quite interesting. And although that was never my intention, and I think that most people, this is a very unusual person, a person who struggled with things. Professor Mordechai Breuer commented to me that not since Rabbi Yaakov Emden was there a Gadol Yisrael was so complicated. So I had to portray this, and I think I successfully was able to show the struggles. I think most people came away with a sense of admiration and appreciation. Some people might have had a different perspective, might have seen that maybe he didn't do right by his wife, things like that. But I think most people realize that this is a person pushed in a position that he really didn't have any control over, and it's a sad story all around. So I'm happy that people receive this inspiration, but when I sat down to write it, I was writing it as an academic work, and at hagiography, you leave out the things that are not comfortable for you. I wasn't writing, quote, Orthodox history, by which I mean that with Orthodox history, you know what the result is, and you just are trying to get there. My job was to write the history and offer my interpretations as best I could. And if it turned out, for example, that at the end of his life, in his deathbed, he rejected everything he stood for and became a Satmar Chassid, I would have had to report that as well, because I'm trying to report the truth and the history of it. And I do think that with figures, great figures, they don't suffer from that, because greatness is such that it should be able to withstand critical scrutiny. And if it can't, then maybe you have to ask yourself, are we really dealing with great people? But great people also have conflicts and turmoil. Rabbi Weinberg, in one of his early essays, his essay actually on Achad Ha'am, writes that, and you could say this about himself as well, great people don't see it as a compliment if you say they have no contradictions in
Precisely.
turmoils.
Yeah. But sometimes the greater the person, the greater the conflict. Chazal even echo that. They say, Kol hagodol mechaver yitzro gadol mimenu. So that certainly is well rooted. But I should also point out that you've also published Sfarim of Rabbi Chil Yaakov Weinberg, not just English biographies, but actually Sfarim that are available for Talmidei Chachamim to pore over the writings of Baal Sridei Eish.
In fact, there's an interesting bibliographical story about this. I published, in my research, I came across numerous articles he wrote which were not known, as well as hundreds and hundreds of letters. I have a collection, probably 500-600 letters, and I still keep getting new ones. It wasn't that long ago, someone sent me a few letters from him to Bialik, and many other figures. And I received these, by the way, by all people who were very generous. Think of Rosh Yeshiva in America, for instance, Rav Gifter. He was very generous in giving me letters. I received from the whole spectrum, the whole gamut of the Jewish community, shared the letters they had, and they thought this was an important thing that someone was going to write about the Sridei Eish. So I published this first volume in 1999, and you'll find it. I've seen it in Batei Midrash. You'll find it in Bnei Brak, and it's interesting that Rav Avram Shapiro, the great Gaon of Merkas Harav, actually referred to it in one of his writings. And so why do I mention this story? Is because if you look on the back page, it says, published with the assistance of the University of Scranton. Now, I don't know how many people know this, but the University of Scranton is a Jesuit institution.
Yeah.
Had I been working at a school like Holy Cross, I don't think I could have said that, but I do believe this is the first sefer in history, and it's a sefer on halachic writings, including some important shuvot in there, such as autopsy and other matters. I think it's probably the first volume of halacha ever published with the assistance of Catholic money. So I think that's of significance.
Wow. Maybe you could comment. I often reflect on this, how lamentable it is that we don't find that type of kolbo today, like Rav Weinberg, who is completely immersed in the Yam HaTorah on the one hand, but on the other hand feels very comfortable corresponding and having friendships with people who are completely outside the spectrum of orthodoxy, and not only is able to correspond with them, but have actually meaningful friendships and relationships with these people.
Yes, it's a very good point. When I was publishing the second volume, which includes a lot of letters, someone said to me that I shouldn't include the name of one of these people he corresponds with, Samuel Atlas, because Samuel Atlas was teaching at the Hebrew Union College. He was a childhood friend of Rabbi Weinberg, wasn't part of the Orthodox world, and then it became a bit controversial when I published that. And it's interesting precisely because of what you said. The reason that some people were upset that I published that, because I showed who he was close to, Lignai, as you could say, is the exact same reason that so many people were so happy. And they saw this as Lishvach, because they see this as a positive thing, that a great Torah sage, despite not agreeing ideologically with certain matters, could have respectful friendships. Rabbi Soloveitchik had with Rabbi Shubo, conservative rabbi in Boston, who actually helped him. So they didn't, there was fears that Rabbi Soloveitchik could be indicted. They had this scandal of he had been slandered by other Orthodox rabbis for his involvement in kashrus. And if you look in the letters of Rabbi Soloveitchik, where he explains how much he respects Rabbi Shubo, even though he can't go to his synagogue when they had a day of honoring him, you see the conflict there. Dr. Belkin was very friendly with the Reform rabbi in Providence, Rhode Island. So we do have these figures that were able to have these relationships. I even know in Toronto, since we're here, Rabbi Felder used to give a Talmud class with conservative rabbis. There was a time when you had these old-time Talmidei Chachamim they all came from the same world, although they diverged later on. But the friendships were still there, the familial connections, and we don't have that anymore. First of all, in the non-Orthodox world, you don't have those old Talmidei Chachamim that come out of the great yeshivas like we used to have. And second of all, we're so divergent and so much in conflict that such relationships today are unimaginable. But in those days, they weren't unimaginable. Nassim Kamenetsky reports in his book that his father was once at a wedding, and he was talking to Shaul Lieberman, and Rav Aaron Kotler came over to him and said, "You can't talk to him. can't look a Russia in the face, and Rav Yaakov ignored Rav Aaron. So you see, it's interesting to show Rav Aaron's aspect, and everyone likes to point to what Rav Aaron said, but Rav Yaakov had a very different attitude, that of course I don't think he should be teaching in the seminary, but why does that mean that we shouldn't have any relationship with him? There was a time when that was much more common than it is today.
Right. Okay. So regarding Torah biographies in general, do you have any conflict? I know that you have this academic integrity that you have to remain loyal and faithful to, but how do you balance that with the importance of A, avoiding Lashon Hara, and B, preserving the prestige of rabbinic leaders? And what advice would you give to someone who's trying to embark on that kind of biography?
Well, I would say, first of all, that if you feel that you're going to write a biography about someone and he's not going to come out looking so good, and you don't want that result, then you can't write the biography. Because you can't write a biography and leave out important information. But if you have a choice not to do a biography, if you choose not to. No one's forcing you to write about a certain figure. But let me just say about the issue of Lashon Hara. First of all, there's a technical question. Is there such a thing as Lashon Hara about people who are deceased? But there's the larger issue of respect for Torah sages, etc. Why are we so sure that complete knowledge is a bad thing? Even if there's a terrible mistake made, we're not the Catholic Church where the congregants are told, this is your bishop. The Gedolim, we make the Gedolim. We choose who are going to be our great Torah sages. And if it turns out that a certain very knowledgeable person was involved in some terrible dispute and acted in a horrible way, that perhaps is the information that should be available to people. Lashon Hara is a tricky thing because I read more private rabbinic correspondence probably than most people. And you often find in it all sorts of attacks against other rabbis. And how could they write that? Isn't it Lashon Hara? The answer is that we know that Lashon Hara is permitted as evil talk if it's l'to'elet, if it's for a purpose. And these rabbis obviously think it's for a purpose. If you're dealing with a great figure, and the Chazon Ish says that we have to know everything about our great figures, we're not dealing with just some guy on the street. Great figures, it's important for us to know this. And just because they're a great figure doesn't give them an exemption. On the contrary, we need to know, are they really so great? And Nassim Kamenetsky elaborates on this in his book, Making of a Gadol, and I agree that with the truly great figures, the deeper you get, the more impressed you are. If there is a figure, and if once you take away the veneer, you find out it's really rotten there, but because he's been built up by all sorts of followers, he's regarded as some great figure, that is perhaps a person who should be regarded as a great figure.
That should not.
Should not be regarded.
Yeah.
So I don't... Great figures are different, as the Chazon Ish said, and we have a responsibility to know about them. If they could be a great Talmudic scholar, but in their personal lives are completely immoral, that's a different issue. Now, I do admit there will be times there will be a problem. For example, let's say I had been researching a rabbi and I found out that maybe he had a youthful indiscretion and he fathered a child, let's say, out of wedlock or something like that. And then I would not want to be the person to write a biography and reveal this if this is not known, for the simple reason that, I think even great figures have privacy. But then I couldn't write about this individual because, that's such an important thing to...
Well, unless that episode in their lives contributed to the texture of who that person actually became.
Exactly. Or if this person, for example, abandoned this child and wanted nothing to do with it, I think that would be knowledge that people should know, because this would show he's not such a great person. But I do think even great people have privacy, and that there are certain things. I'm not saying... All I'm saying is that I couldn't write about it, because if I felt that it would maybe destroy his reputation, yes, if I could put it in that context, I think that would be advantageous. And Rav Aaron Lichtenstein wrote once that we do not have any work like Augustine's Confessions. Here in our circles, for some reason, that we do not have a literature of great rabbis showing how they struggled, they made mistakes, because they would be regarded as outside the fold. And I think
although I know that doesn't Rabbi Yaakov Emden have something like
he wrote it himself, so and it hasn't yet appeared. Notice it hasn't appeared to complete his the complete edition hasn't yet appeared yet. People are afraid to publish it, perhaps. But take Mother Teresa. Let me give you an example. Mother Teresa had correspondence with one of her spiritual advisors, and in this correspondence, she reflected on how sometimes she doubted God's presence and even perhaps His existence. She went through dark periods. But she didn't throw it all away and move to Paris and become this, pleasure-seeking person. She still stayed where she was, knowing that, people have ups and downs in faith, and she remained committed to the task. I think if we had a great rabbi, and by the way, they published these letters, even though she asked them not to, but the church thought it was very important for this to be published so people see that even a saint goes through struggles of faith. We do not have that. I think if we had a great rabbi who confessed to these periods, and there certainly were great rabbis who had this, but because everyone goes through struggles like this, the people who had these letters would never allow them to be published, because this person would then not be regarded as a gadol. It seems that in our circles we don't appreciate the complexity of individuals enough to know that faith can be rocky and stormy. And that's why you mentioned Rebecca Venden is so interesting, because he wrote that, and he lets us in on his life. And Viaderis is another interesting one, Rav Kook's father-in-law. His autobiography, you see the various disputes he had and issues he had. And you see this with Rabbi Weinberg, because he had this correspondence with Samuel Atlas. Rabbi Weinberg didn't have a wife. He was divorced early on. Had he had a wife, he would talk to her perhaps about these issues. And he didn't feel he could speak to maybe other Gedolim about it because maybe they wouldn't understand. But his childhood friend, I shouldn't say childhood, youthful friend, who was no longer in that world but could understand it, Rabbi Weinberg was able to reflect on those matters that troubled him, matters of Jewish law, which bothered him, that he thought that should be decided differently, ways Jews regard non-Jews, things of that nature which trouble all sorts of people. And David Berger, there was a lot of controversy when I published these letters, and David Berger wrote an article a number of years ago in this volume published in the Orthodox Forum, and he said, as far as he's concerned, it was worth publishing these letters just to show that having these sorts of struggles is not equal, quote, prikat ha'ol, that you can remain committed, a Torah Jew, in this case a Gadol B'Yisrael, and still struggle over these matters. And Rabbi Weinberg never rejected any halachot, but he showed that he troubled him.
So let me ask you, what do you think it is? Is there a certain insecurity within Orthodox leadership that makes this the exception and not the rule? Is it insecurity? Is it another concern that people will leave Yiddishkeit if they read these stories? I'm asking you to conjecture.
It's a good question. And if you look at the Talmud, they tell us all about Reish Lakish, Rabbi Akiva. They don't seem to have any problem telling us, where they started, where they ended up, and that shows how great they are, where they ended up. But in our world, we don't. Now, why not? Is it insecurity? It's almost like they have to be like Moshe, holy from birth, without any complexity. Rav Aaron Cutler, this is what got Rav Nosson Kamenetsky in so much trouble. Rav Aaron Cutler had a sister who was a communist, tried to get him off the Torah path, and Rav Aaron himself, apparently we scored the stories. There were times he wasn't sure which direction he was going to go. These are the sorts of things that are problematic, and I really don't understand why. I don't know if it's insecurity or somehow the idea came in to our world that great Torah sages must start at the beginning and move in one direction, never vacillating and never having the sort of emotional issues, the sort of intellectual or even faith issues that we all have, the average person, but the Gadol has to be above all that. And it doesn't seem to be a realistic portrayal. And
perhaps if we had more of this multifaceted type of biography and portrayal, so many people who do struggle might be able to take comfort in these.
That's what people told me, that they enjoyed the Rabbi Weinberg book so much. And Nosson Kamenetsky, in the introduction to his books, does speak about why this is important and how you have to write real history. In the introduction to his book, he talks about the difference in hagiography and biography. And that's the point he made, but we know the reaction to him. And the only conclusion we can draw from this is that at least the leadership in the Haredi world, they do not want that type of biography. They want only hagiography. However, in the more modern population, books like I wrote, I think, are not just an intellectual necessity, they're even a spiritual necessity. I see this now, years later, because our people in our communities, they're reading academic biographies of John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. They're reading sophisticated general biographies. We can't expect them to be happy with just hagiographies.
Yes, but you'd be surprised at how many of the Haredi community have read your biography as well, although they won't admit to it.
No, they'll admit to it.
They may admit to it.
No, I know that because they, not just that, my classes I give online, my Torah Motion classes, I think most are from the Haredi world. My blogs, I do on a Svarim blog. I think most readers are in the Haredi world. I have many, many contacts in the Haredi world. I get emails from B'nai Brak, Kiryat Sefer. Now, why is that? Because the Haredi world is an intellectual world, and there's a whole group of sophisticated, learned people in that world that, for a variety of reasons, live in a certain world that maybe publicly they can't be as open as they want, but privately among like peers, I'm not talking about one or two, I'm talking about there's a whole circle there. You can see them on the internet. These are very learned people, and in many respects, these are the people my peers, my intellectual interlocutors, and because they are all interested in this, and they know the difference between hagiography, and some of them maybe feel that hagiography is valuable for others in their community. But all the intellectuals in the Haredi world, and the Haredi world is full of intellectuals, they all read serious material.
Right. And Dr. Shapiro, that may be a great segue into your other area of interest, which is on the subject of the formulation of dogma within Judaism, and also the conflict that people have had with some of your writings, even though you're clearly not the only one in the academic community that has written about this. So, regarding the Ikrim, I know that many people have either banned some your writing on the Rambam's Ikrim for demonstrating or that the Rambam may have been influenced by his social milieu and his cultural milieu in writing the Ikrim, for writing about the dissenting Rishonim who do not quantify the Ikrim the same way that the Rambam does, and people have drawn a line in the sand saying, you don't mess with the Ikrim. So how do you respond to that kind of idea?
First, before I published the book, I wrote a long article on this, and I received a letter from a well-known figure in the yeshiva world, a well-known mashgiach, and he wrote to me that what I wrote was dangerous because he says, we all know about these views, but the average person doesn't, and you're putting ammunition in their hands. To which my response was that I'm not telling your students to read it. I'm writing an academic article. If they choose to read it, but the point was that that something here is dangerous. I don't see. First of all, I wrote this was an academic work, although it began as a response in I guess you would say, an Orthodox journal, the Torah Mata journal. It was a study and so that was what started it all. It was an academic work, a study of responses to the Rambam, alternative views of dogma, rejection of his dogma. So I was quite surprised at the response. I mean, the forward had a whole piece on it. I think it's linked to a Wikipedia page for me, and there's a link to that, to the forward article. Eichler's in Borough Park removed the book from his shelves. This goes back to 2004, but Eichler's in Flatbush continue to sell it. So maybe there's a difference. And some of the people in the Haredi world, one well-known figure in Aguda circles, said to me, he doesn't know what all the controversy is. You're just quoting Rishonim. And others, their attitude was, no, this is something that we don't want the masses, because then they're going to assume that these views are legitimate. Now, I never said one way or the other. I was just presenting the argument. And I never argued in terms of acceptance. My argument was that the idea that you can ban study and make, ex cathedra declarations that, the Rambam is the last word, that this is historically incorrect. And so I never tried to determine what a believing Jew should believe. What I did think I proved is that it's too simplistic. Just remember, the original article by Rabbi Parnas it wasn't just about what Jews should believe. He said that you can't even read material that diverges from the 13 principles. So my point was that that means that a whole segment of our Torah literature has to be removed, including Rashi, which we're supposed to read every week on Chumash, because the end of Rashi and Devarim mentions the view that the end of the Torah was not written by Moshe. So that really is where it all began.
Okay. And have you found yourself having to defend the book at different venues?
Yeah, occasionally. Mostly the response was that, again, a misreading of what I was trying to do. Things like, I've been asked, well, why do you think these views are legitimate? Which I never said they're legitimate. I certainly don't think it's legitimate. One of the longest chapters dealt with opposition to the Rambam's view that God is incorporeal. I certainly don't think it's legitimate for someone to believe that God has a physical form, although tomorrow I'll speak about that's not the issue. The issue is, let's say someone does believe it, how do you judge him? And so that's sort of the question, questions of isn't this sort of, you're putting, someone wrote to me, I still have the email, a very interesting email for someone in the yeshiva world. He says, I write in this book a lot about the esoteric Rambam, how the Rambam thought that certain teachings were dangerous for the masses. And he says, since you obviously consider yourself a Maimonidean, and I don't know why you assume that, he says, why don't you follow his message? By putting this out there, you're directly diverging from the Rambam because you're giving the masses views they shouldn't have. So it was using the Rambam's esoteric approach against me and saying, you better than anyone should know that this is not the sort of material that should be out there because it's dangerous. I'm not sure why it's dangerous. Why is it dangerous? When we study halacha, we study all the views, the rejected views, the views that no one has followed since the days of the Gemara. We certainly study the view that you can eat chicken and milk and all these other views. So why is it in halacha that we're careful to study all the views and the ramifications, but when it comes to hashkafa or emunah, all of a sudden it's only about indoctrination?
Well, there may be some connective tissue between the previous discussion about hagiographies, which is there may be some insecurity or perhaps a fear that if too much of this information gets out, it may cause people to lose some of their faith or depart, because sort of like Yiddishkeit is viewed as this perfectly woven garment, and once you start pulling out a thread at the hem, the whole thing may start to fall apart.
I understand that. I've never, by the way, said that I don't criticize Art Scroll, for instance, in their biographies or other works. I don't believe that everyone needs to be exposed to the same thing, but I mean, for people who want to pick up and know the truth and want to read an academic work, I want to put everything out there. In certain communities, I understand that, look, when we have children, we don't teach them everything. In certain communities, they don't have backgrounds in these areas. Someone once came up to me and asked me about it. There's a certain Hasidic leader that someone had uncovered certain stories. It didn't appear in academic writings. And he wanted me to speak to his son about this, and because he didn't like the fact that his son had become a chassid. And I said that it's not important. I don't think that's important. If he wants to read the academic literature, he can. But I don't believe that all this knowledge needs to be spread to everyone at all times. So I do believe there's different types of knowledge for different types of people. Rav Kook speaks about this. Rav Kook says that even if you know something is true, you shouldn't tell it to people if you think it's going to destroy their faith. For example, I don't think you should go into Mea Sharim and start talking there, about how Torah and evolution, could be woven together. They've never heard of Darwin. That to them, that's not an issue. So Rav Kook believed that even truths do not need to be shared with people if they're not. It's not a concern for them. So, but the people reading my book on the 13 Principles are obviously interested in knowing about medieval Jewish philosophy, disputes. So
I think you spent a very short amount of time on responding to the argument that the Chassam Sofer in the 19th century had already said that we paskin like the 13 Ikrim.
The Chassam Sofer does say that it's not necessarily clear he's referring to all the Ikarim. He's referring to in particular the view of the Mashiach versus the view of Hillel, Rabbi Hillel in the Gemara, that it already happened. But it could refer to everything. The idea that you can decide non-halachic matters of faith in a halachic fashion. And the Chassam Sofer does say that. There's no question about it. He says there was a dispute. The dispute's now been decided, and everyone must accept this. However, I don't find any Rishonim who say that. Also, there's a psychological problem with that. How do you, if you believe something, you can no longer affirm it publicly, but how can you change your belief based upon what's been decided? And the Rambam perhaps recognizes this because in the Mishnah Torah, unlike other places, unlike in the Parish of Mishnah, the Mishnah Torah, he's very clear. He says, "Ha'omer." He's always, you have to say it publicly. If you look at the Rishonim, you see that they didn't think that way. One example I did not give in the book because I didn't know it, but I did write about it in one of my blog posts, is the Tosfos Rid, the Rishai Mitrani. He's in showing that the Rambam is wrong, that you must believe that God does not have a physical form. And according to the Rambam, if you believe he has a physical form, you're a heretic. Rishai Mitrani says that, he of course thinks it's wrong, but he says you're not a heretic, and his proof is, this is just one example, that we see that there were sages in the Talmud who believed that. That in and of itself would be shocking to certain people that a Rishon says this. But the Rid does not say what the Chasam Sofer says. That it was permissible for them, but now that it's, quote, been decided according to halacha, no one can. What the Rid says is that from the fact that we see the sages of the Talmud held this, and we don't regard them as heretics, that shows that even subsequently, even in our day, it remains something we don't assume you're a heretic. So he doesn't fall into this idea that it used to be an Ikar Emunah, but and it used to not be, but now it is. For the Rid and for many others, an Ikar Emunah is an eternal truth, right? Not something that changes. According to the Chasam Sofer's conception, if the Gedolim today were to rule that you have to believe God has a physical form, then you have to, or you're a heretic. And the Rambam also thinks it's an eternal truth. That it doesn't matter if all the rabbis in the world, except for him, were to declare that God has a physical form, it doesn't change matters, that it's still an Ikar Emunah, that he does not have a physical form.
Right, because he was able to derive this based on logic, on Aristotelian
exactly.
logic.
It's eternal
right.
Torah truth. But the Chasam Sofer does believe it changes. And in my article I deal with this. Rav Kook actually goes both ways. In one place, Rav Kook agrees with the Chasam Sofer that you can decide this. In another place, he says differently. He says it's a machokas Bavli and Yerushalmi. He says Bavli holds you can decide on these matters. And he derives this because there's a machokas about when you go to Sanhedrin. According to Rav Kook, and Rav Herzog says the same thing, they claim that the Bavli holds that the Sanhedrin can decide matters of faith, whereas the Yerushalmi holds they can't, only matters of halacha. So maybe it's a machokas Bavli and Yerushalmi.
What's also curious is that these kinds of discussions really get started in earnest in the 19th century with the rise of theological challenges from within Judaism.
Well, they also existed in medieval times, and then sort of no one talked about it for a while, and then it starts again. I mean, Jews always respond to what's going on in the wider world, the non-Jewish world. There's a reason why the Rambam and Rav Sadia Gaon, in that world, they were formulating these principles. That doesn't mean that people do not have belief, but the way you formulate it as a catechism, the way the Rambam does, that's in response. Already the Abarbanel and others mention it to what the Muslims were doing.
Right. Okay. Well, I want to thank you again for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And I look forward to hearing all of your words over Shabbos, and keep up the great work that you're doing, and you're a gift to our people. Thank you.
You're too kind. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening, and we wish you all the best.